authentic. We'll make an authentic recording. Just authenticity. It's
Well, I'm
important.
going to go ahead and mute my video and audio, but I'll be in the background in case anything seems to start to go sideways.
Okay. And then I am not going to otherwise manage this, Karen. So if although I can if you need me to. So I'm trusting you to manage that. Um, well, is that okay, Karen? Yeah, I guess it is. She just showed up again. So
She gave thumbs up.
okay. Well, it's a minute after the hour. So since this is also being recorded, so if people come slightly late, they can still see it. Just go back to the beginning. I'll start. It is my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. Marilisa Jimenez Garcia, who is Associate Professor of Children's and Young Adult Literary Cultures at Rutgers University, Camden, Department of Childhood Studies. And she is the author of the award-winning book, which I recommend to you, the award-winning book Side by Side, U.S. Empire, Puerto Rico, and the Roots of American Youth Literature and Culture, which is a groundbreaking and a comprehensive study of the contributions of Puerto Ricans to American youth literature and culture, like it says in the title. And I said award-winning because the book won the Children's Literature Association Book Prize in 2023, which is kind of a big deal. Actually, it is a big deal. And I say that as someone who has won the honor book, but never the prize for that. So I'm not just blowing smoke. It's a big deal. It is also my pleasure to introduce Sonia Alejandra Rodriguez, who is professor of English at LaGuardia Community College, CUNY School, and they are a poet, a creative writer of both fiction and nonfiction, and a scholar. And with Sarah Park Dowling, they co-edit the journal Research on Diversity in Youth Literature, which is really the newest journal devoted to scholarly journal devoted to children's literature, and one that's already making a big impact on critical and quite public conversations about literature for young readers. So if you're not checking that journal out, you probably should be. And the two of them are here today. They are joining us today to talk about the next thing, their next big thing, their co-edited book, Ethnic Studies and Youth Literature, A Critical Reader, which is forthcoming this July from SUNY Press. So we're getting a sneak preview here today, folks. And please make welcome in the way that you can make welcome over Zoom, Professors Marilisa Jimenez Garcia and Sonia Alejandra Rodriguez. And I'm going to mute myself now and clap.
Thank you so much. We're going to share a quick presentation just to go through some of our ideas. We want to leave plenty of room for Q&A. So make sure you're using the Q&A button to ask us anything about the project, about the field. We're happy to have a conversation, especially because we're so grateful, right, for this invitation to talk about our book that hasn't come out yet, but it will be out in the summer. So we're hoping to continue to have these conversations. I'll go ahead and turn it to Marilisa. And Marilisa, when you want me to go to the next slide, just let me know.
Yeah, you can go ahead. Thank you. Yay. Okay. All right. So as Sonia was saying, thank you so much for everyone giving us this opportunity, also Kansas State, to talk about our new book. As you saw, the beautiful book cover, to see this all come together. And actually, we started talking about it in 2021. So we were actually thinking about like how long it's taken, but maybe not as long as other books may have taken. But we wanted to start off by talking about like who we are, and our positionalities and that sort of thing. And I wanted to say, as I usually say, that I'm a Nuyo Miami Rican, because I grew up in sort of around the area of New York City, and then I lived in South Florida for most of my life. Went to PhD in the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. And this is actually a picture of my elementary school, which I'm in front of in Kearney, New Jersey. And then my middle school, which is actually no longer there, it was actually torn down, which was called Jefferson Davis Middle School in West Palm Beach, Florida. And I sort of say this just to say that, as someone who's kind of grown up under, you know, a lot of restrictions in terms of what I could read growing up in my curriculum. You know, there really was just an absence of Latino history, Latino culture. You know, to me, it's sort of like when book bans were just normalized, because a lot of what we ended up, you know, really hearing was very much a normalized idea of book banning, meaning you just don't see anything that isn't sort of seen as like normative Anglo-American history and literature. So just thinking about that in terms of how I grew up, I actually never read a book by a Latino author until I got to graduate school. So next slide. Thank you. I just wanted to also talk about like where I sit as a scholar. So, you know, as Dr. Nelson said, for example, I wrote a book, which I'll talk about in a second too, Side by Side. But really like the big areas that have always interested me as a scholar coming up, and also coming up in places where I noticed there just was a lot of disconnection in a lot of the ways that people talked about children and childhood, and also like where I fit as a Puerto Rican woman in all of it, or where Latinos fit in sort of the history of US culture. So first of all, US empire and American childhood, nationhood has been something that's really been intriguing to me always. And ethnic studies has been a way that I have gotten through to that. So I feel like what I like about ethnic studies, it's its interest in decoloniality, in communities of color fighting sort of for their intellectual sovereignty. I love that it comes from student activism. And so some of the readings that I did right around Mignolo, Lee Patel, Christine Sleeter, who actually really influenced this book as well. Specifically, I found a home early on in my career around Latinx and Puerto Rican studies at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, especially. And what I was really interested in there was this idea of a working class diaspora, right? And working class sort of practices within the Latino community. And again, out of student activists, working class student activists who demanded a space, specifically where I was working at the time at CUNY, for it to exist, to have this library and archive. Also Black Boricua, Boricua epistemologies, Latino womanist pedagogies really were where I found a home as a scholar as well. You know, people like Iris Morales, Pura Belpré, Angeles Pastor, the Black Latinas No Collective, and various education scholars. So I really found early on that I had a hard time really seeing myself within children's literature and the humanities and ethnic studies, Puerto Rican studies, education, and these ideas really were where I found kind of like a knowledge home. I've always really been interested in knowledge production and ideas about like historical erasure, including ideas about how kind of race impacts what we think about crafts and aesthetic. But questions I've always asked myself too is like, what is research? Does my research tell a single story, or am I reading something that is really coming from a single story kind of narrative? And this is maybe why my community got left out. And obviously, you know, youth literature and culture, which is where I definitely have an intellectual home now. But it wasn't like that early on in my career. But big questions like, what is children's literature? What is childhood? Who is the child reader, the ideal child reader? What about performance and embodiment? Cultural workers and text. So I'm really interested also in performance, for example, and that was something I talked about in my first book. And do cultural ideals impact how we think genre needs to work? So how does YA work in the US? Or the picture book needs to work a certain way. The middle grade novel, fantasy, sci-fi, sort of like cultural ideas that have controlled even the way we talk about genre. Next slide. So as Dr. Nell said, the first book I wrote actually came out in 2021, and it was Side by Side, U.S. Empire, Puerto Rico, and the Roots of American Youth Literature and Culture, which came out of also my dissertation work. And that's really like the takeaway that I would say is coming into this book, right? Because that was a very specific case around Puerto Rican history and culture, and also the history of U.S. imperialism in Puerto Rico. But the big takeaway is really using U.S. empire as a lens within youth literature, and really looking at U.S. empire as a critical study, and really kind of collapsing also the US as multiple settler colonial kind of projects, which really impact what we think about race, what we think about culture and ethnicity. And one of the big things too that I wanted to highlight in that book is the way that children's literature has really been like on the front lines of many social movements in Puerto Rico. And here there's just like a huge picture that I think like really talks about this, right? And this is during the Ricky Renuncia protests where we ousted the governor of Puerto Rico. And literally, there were people who were reading children's books, during that protest and using them as a means of kind of highlighting stories about Hurricane Maria and that sort of thing. So I really wanted to show like this interrelationship between children's literature and social movements. And I did that in the first book, side by side, specifically in Puerto Rico. Next slide. I also have had the opportunity to see this kind of storytelling aspect through, and the kind of stories we tell our young people, especially through creative writing and actually working with Meg Medina in the She Persisted series. So we did the one on Pura Belpre, and that was like a really rewarding experience, obviously, helping to tell this story for 7-year-olds. Like, how do you explain colonialism in Puerto Rico to a 7-year-old audience, right? And actually, one of the things I like to tell people about that experience was some of the moments during the publishing process where we had these conversations, sort of like, well, do we really want to use the word colony? Not with Meg Medina, but more with the publishers that sort of coming back and saying, well, I don't know if they're really going to understand colony. And I remember saying sort of like, well, kids have grown up in colonies. Like I grew up in a colony, right? So there's like this push and pull of really trying to, or wanting to admit that the US is an empire, that the US has active colonies, right? And this even happened in this book. And so the compromise there was the word colonial territory, because we didn't want to use sort of like pure colony. And I just like to kind of bring that up to kind of think about, again, this lack of, or this desire to not really see the US for the ways that it's occupied lands, right? And continues to do so. So that's part of my career as well. Next slide. And now Sonia.
Hi, everyone. I want to talk a little bit about, like, similar to Marilisa, what has inspired my career and how it led me to this book with Marilisa. I'm currently in Queens, New York. This is where I've been for about the last 10 years. I work at a community college. And so my approach to research is a little bit different because I'm at a community college. And so my responsibilities or what I prioritize is more service, more student-centered. I prioritize that because my institution also prioritizes that, right? So I'm not at an R1 or a liberal arts, right, where I necessarily have like the support to be investigating children's literature in a similar way. And so when I talk about ethnic studies or when I talk about my work, I've really had to find tangible applications for how can I share this with my students? How does it turn into activism? Are there events that I can plan? Are there ways that I can help my students apply some of these concepts in their real lives? And as I was working on this presentation, I realized that I've been talking about like the same sort of concept or topic for about like 15 years, right? I write a lot about conocimiento narratives, which is a term that I created as part of my dissertation that feels such a long time ago. But essentially, I'm just really invested in thinking about knowledge creation and using knowledge as like a form for healing, right? How can we inform ourselves? How can we know more, know differently, to find a way for healing not only the self but community as well. And so I look at this concept in children's literature, specifically Latina children's literature, and I'm really interested in thinking about the ways that the protagonists are engaging with systems of oppression and how they navigate those systems to get to a path of healing, right? Are they doing this healing by themselves? Are they taking folks with them? And then obviously at the end of the novel or at the end of the story, what has been that healing process and what does that healing for communities look like? My interest in healing and using children's books to talk about these concepts is because so much of my foundation for understanding like my own healing journey, right, stemmed a lot from like my own childhood. And when I started working with young people at youth centers or as a resident artist or in volunteer spaces, a lot of what I found myself trying to explain to young people is that there are systems in place that are meant purposefully created to make sure that they do not succeed. Right. I found myself throughout my career, throughout like my activism, just having to remind or to inform young people, teens, right, middle schoolers, that if they're having a hard time in their life, it's likely because there are systems that were created or that are put in place to make sure that that happens. Because a lot of the times these young people think that like that their life is difficult because of something they did, right? That their life or the challenges that they might be encountering, it's because of who they are, right? That something about them is wrong. And so they've internalized a lot of the isms that we recognize. And so because of my work with a lot of young people, right, it inevitably impacted my scholarship and my creative writing. How can I encourage people? How can I inform people? How can I share with the people that you're not a bad person? Things aren't happening to you because you're a bad person, right? But that there are systems, empires, imperialisms in place um, that are further marginalizing, like people of color, um, LGBTQI communities, women, right? That it's not the self. And so my research in that way, thinking about healing in terms of like the self and how we can then open it up to our community, has then transformed into thinking about the environment, right, and climate change and environmental justice. And so the chapter that I'll talk about later in this presentation, that's in this ethnic studies and youth literature book that'll be out in July, I write about environmental justice and thinking about how do we move from community healing to thinking about climate change and thinking about the impact that our own healing journey can have on the planet. So while I'm trying to balance all of these like responsibilities as a researcher, as an educator, because it's always really important to me that my research is always tied to the people, right? I don't write about children's literature abstractly, right? I don't talk about the abstract child. I'm always very much aware that there are literal children reading these books. And I think about like the impact that these books can have on actual children. Um, and so that also just led to my involvement in Riddle, the open access journal at the University of Illinois, research on diversity in youth literature, which I co-edit with Dr. Sarah Park Dahlen. And much of what I do on that journal is create more space for like conversations for like marginalized folks who are doing research in children's literature, and to have a space, an academic space, um, to expand, right, what we think about children's literature scholarship. And so I've just been very fortunate to read in that position as co-editor to see how much the field has changed. Marilisa like briefly mentioned um, that she's in a youth studies like job now, but that wasn't the case when she started. And that definitely wasn't the case when I started. I don't know how long it's been, like 15 years 20, I don't know. But when I was getting my PhD, right, like children's literature wasn't seen as like a serious field, right? So I couldn't find a job in Latino studies. I couldn't find a job in like ethnic studies departments. And I got a job in an English department, but that's because I was like promoting myself as like an Americanist, right? Not as a children's literature scholar. And to watch that field change and how much respect that field has garnered, it has been like an amazing just trajectory. To see how many more grad students are at these children's literature conferences who want to learn more about like BIPOC, like children's lit scholarship has always been inspiring, right? And it continues to be inspiring. I'm also a creative writer. So I have an MFA in fiction. And very much like what I've just shared in terms of like my research, it's an interesting process to see how my research informs my creative writing and how I can use what I know about a children's literature, what I know about like empires and like just these different systems of oppression, and how I can um, like filter that information, how I can manipulate that information in a more creative way to create stories that center BIPOC people, their experiences of BIPOC people. So that's been a really amazing journey for me. I have a QR code that just takes you to my website. If you want to learn a little bit more about me, you can see my creative writing. You can learn more about my research, or you can see what I published. So I can leave that there for you. We're not going to switch to talk about our book while everyone's here. Yeah, so this is our beautiful cover, Ethnic Studies and Youth Literature, a critical reader. It's coming from SUNY Press in July 2025. Again, you can scan this QR code. It'll take you to the SUNY Press website. We already have an amazing review for this book. We're super excited for what this book has become, right? Like right now it's available for pre-order for the hardcovers. I strongly recommend that your academic libraries be the ones to purchase these. In July, it'll also come out as an ebook, which will be more affordable and accessible. And then the paperback comes out in December, which again will be a much more affordable option than the hardcover. This book is a timely book. The folks in this collection are scholars of color, women of color, non-binary. I'm a non-binary person that really are engaging with the fields and centering a conversation that puts ethnic studies and people of color right at the center. Much of like, and Marilisa and I have both said this, right, but much of like the scholarship in children's literature tends to be predominantly white, and so we're super excited for this opportunity. I want to show you the names of our contributors. They can't be here, but we're hoping that we'll have more events in the future where we can highlight some of the amazing work that our contributors have done. I can't wait for you to see this book. We open with a poem, again, because what we're trying to do with this book, as Marilisa and I will explain in a little bit, right, is really put these hallmarks of like ethnic studies into play, right? We don't want to just talk about it, we want to be about it. And so our book opens with this wonderful poem by one of Marilisa's students. We have chapters on the Philippines and imperialism. We have a chapter on like post-colonialism in India, right? Asian American studies, African American studies. We have a beautiful interview with Tracy Sorrell and Aaliyah Jones. We have two reprints by the amazing Violet Harris, another one by Debbie Reese. And then Marilisa is going to talk a little bit about her chapter in a minute. But yeah, I just want to put these folks' name out there, right? Like we couldn't have made this book possible without them. And I'm sure our audience and readers will have a lot to learn from their individual chapters as well.
Thank you, Sonia. That was amazing. I love listening also to my colleagues, so this is amazing. And to celebrate this along with you is an honor. But as Sonia was also saying, you know, we opened the book actually with a poem that's by Alisa Lina Flores, and it's called My Curriculum, and it was actually something she recited at a rally for ethnic studies at Lehigh University, first institution that I worked at, where I organized with students of color to create the first Institute on Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. And actually, this graphic comes from the work that I did at the Institute. We were a fiery bunch. We lasted for 3 years, right? Until they, you know, sort of had to close had to close this down, but that's a whole other story. But this is a graphic that I think is important. We used to start our conversations at the Institute with this graphic because we really wanted to say sort of like what is ethnic studies? Because it seemed like everyone knew what it was. But you know, very, very rarely did people really kind of identify it as an epistemology. So is it like ethnic people doing ethnic studies? Is that what it means? You know, but no, it really is a science, that it really is an approach. It really is a way forward. And so this is Christine Slater. This is from Transformative Ethnic Studies in Schools, Curriculum, Pedagogy, and Research. And what Slater tells us is that in order for something to be ethnic studies, it has to have something in it with a component of curriculum as counter narrative, right? So curriculum from the perspective of people of color. Specifically, it has to have a sense of criticality, so structural analysis of racism, colonialism that works toward dismantling multiple forms of oppression. So not just an analysis of race, but analysis of race and colonialism as a link to how we get to race, right? Reclaiming cultural identities, deep knowledge, where students come from that challenges deculturalizing, you know, processes, learning about the historical contributions of their communities, intersectionality, multiplicity, attending to students' multiple social identities and their positions within intersecting relations of power, also not seeing communities as monoliths. Community engagement, community-based pedagogies and experiences that bridge classrooms to community and social movements, pedagogy that is culturally responsive and mediated, drawing upon students' lived experiences and sociocultural environments, intentional design of learning spaces around those you know, student lived experiences, and specifically students as intellectuals, respecting and fostering students' curiosity, thinking, and intellectualism, and in many cases, students as leaders of these movements. So this is what it means to have ethnic studies and ethnic studies model. So let me tell you now how that influenced how we created the book and how we organized the book. Next slide. Thank you. So this is just kind of a breakdown for you to understand how the book was organized. And one of the challenges in the beginning too, when we were thinking about doing this book, was we really wanted to resist this idea of like organizing it by cultural community or by ethnicity or by race. We really wanted this to be truly intersectional and truly about a framework of ethnic studies. So out of the Slater sort of epistemology, right, like the graphic I just showed you, we started to think about, well, how does this apply in children's literature? How does this apply to youth literature? Like if we were to apply that model, what would it look like in a book for an author to be participating in ethnic studies through a model like this? And so we came up with also the way to organize the book. So we call this the hallmark of ethnic studies, or the hallmarks of ethnic studies in youth literature. And so section 1, we have youth as intellectuals and storytellers. So books that are participating in ethnic studies kind of epistemology usually center youth as intellectuals and storytellers. So questions we ask, are young people centered in the book as carrying knowledge? Are they complicit in systems of oppression, youth knowledge, and storytelling to challenge status quo and push for liberation in their communities? Section 2, intersectionality and counter narratives. So chapters are organized by hallmarks, not by race and ethnicity. How do traditional racialized categories in the US parallel colonial logics of US imperialism? Diversity within diversity, right? So we have in this collection, we have authors who are Afro-Indigenous. We have South Asian stories within the United States. We have queer Asian American girlhoods, and really trying to think beyond this idea of a monolithic community. Also thinking in section 3 about community frameworks and some of the questions we have for people looking for books in terms of thinking about, is this doing ethnic studies? are community-based social movements and frameworks credited as an intellectual legacy? Do potential solutions involve collective efforts as opposed to individual triumphs? Do tools proposed in a story empower marginalized communities? Slide. Okay, so I'm just briefly going to talk about my chapter. And obviously, like Sonia said, we would love to have everyone here to talk about their individual chapters, but it's our work right now. So thinking about this legacy of the intellectual legacies of the Council on Interracial Books for Children. So my chapter is called The Mirror, the Matrix, and the Movement. Again, spotlighting Council on Interracial Books for Children. And I really wanted to write about this because I feel like the council is one of those things that people really credit and like celebrate. But and there's even like an archive of all of their writings and that sort of thing, especially the bulletin. People really tend to talk about the bulletin. But few people realize that they wrote books specifically outlining their approaches and their theories. And they were really very much about, creating these guidelines, but also larger theoretical frameworks for how to evaluate books. And also, writing down and capturing themselves as evolving in a movement. So these are just some graphics of the kind of bulletin. I wanted to show you the book cover of the book that I talk about in the chapter. And that's this odd book that a lot of people haven't read. But this is actually one that I use in some of my seminars, and it's called Human and Anti-Human Values in Children's Books. It was from 1976 by the council, and the council's kind of interesting too because they don't really say kind of give themselves credit as an author. They just go as the council, though we know that there were, several writers for children's literature, including Nancy Lyric, for example, that someone who a lot of people recognize were part of the council. So in this chapter, what I tend to talk about, next slide, or what I really kind of outline is really thinking about the CIBC as like a precursor, as a forerunner for things like critical race studies. And even before, like, I would say even 10 years before theorists like Derek Bell founded critical race studies and start using words like anti-racism, systemic racism, and a lot of their critical theory, the CIBC was already doing this. So it's 10 years before. And they're very much in concert with sort of like activist statements like the Black Panther 10-point, sort of epistemology, their YLP, and their 13-point program, the Combahee River Collective. And so what I really want to say is this is not just like a nice group of people. This is like a real activist community that really put out an epistemology for us to follow. And I just wonder if we're really taking them seriously in terms of how they postured themselves within these other social movements and even preceded some of the work that we talk about now. They also presented the historical origins of race-based discrimination as imperialism and colonialism. So racial justice was impossible without this key. So anti-racism had to be anti-colonial. And their particular approach was, educating and empowering children and families outside of traditional schooling, spaces to demand change in publishing. So, maybe not like what we think of today in terms of how we want to approach changing children's literature. A lot of us are like, well, we have to talk to the publishers. The CIBC was like, nope, we got to talk to children and families. We have to make sure that they're really trained to create change in the literature that they want to see in the future and not the publishers. CIBC also acted as an important witness of ethnic studies movements, emphasizing children's materials that were key to sustaining these movements. So in many cases in the bulletins, we also see like how they documented things that were happening in real time, such as the Chicano movement, and how, children's literature was part of those movements in many ways. So this is something that I highlight in my chapter that I think is important. Next slide. So one of the things that I say in this particular chapter or quote, for example, is also, again, this idea that they preceded a lot of what we talk about in children's literature, even within multiculturalism. And one of that is, as we all know, Rudeem Sims Bishop and her mirrors, windows, sliding glass doors metaphors, right? The CIBC had this thing called the mirror, but they also had something called the matrix. And so for the mirror flashes with new images, the matrix trembles with change. For the CIBC, the mirror metaphor extended into how personal reflections in the mirror also convey an intersecting system, which was imposing but also fragile and subject to change. Children's books are part of the new educational materials, which must be developed in order to achieve a just society and help prepare children for such a society. Children's books act as a mirror, revealing possibilities for change. Beyond representation and belonging, the mirror matrix would show communities of color as parents, teachers, writers, and their own complicity in anti-Blackness, sexism, gender violence. So they were really also about like communities of color taking an inward look and not just sort of asking the dominant structure, right, to kind of reveal itself, but also how are we being complicit? And that's sort of this idea of the mirror matrix. So and now I pass it to Sonia.
Thank you. I'm so impressed by Phil's links. I clicked on a link and I like moved our PowerPoint. Thank you, Phil, for all those links. Let me go back to my last slide. So for my chapter, I focused on a Latine YA novel, Marco Shiro's Each of Us a Desert, which is also which features two queer characters. And I talk about Each of Us a Desert to talk about environmental justice, healing, and resistance. And so I frame my entire chapter in thinking about young people as storytellers, as knowledge producers, as agents and leaders of knowledge. Because so much of what we understand and the way that we talk about young people is that knowledge is bestowed upon them, handed down to them, which is true. But I want it to highlight, and in this section of the book of the ethnic studies book, is to think about how young people are at the center of creating knowledge and transforming their communities, right? So that knowledge isn't top down, right? But that it could be more lateral, that it could be cyclical. And I believe that Each of Us a Desert demonstrates that. If you haven't read Each of Us a Desert, I strongly recommend it. It's such a good book. I really hope it's made into a movie. It's such a good book. But the main character has this ability, right? She's called a cuentista, and she has this ability to literally take folks' like confessions or stories, and she stores them in her body, like literally stored in her belly. And part of her ritual is that she needs to go into the desert to regurgitate this information that has been given to her, and she like buries it on the earth to return to the deity in the book. And so I follow this process, right? This routine, this ceremony that the protagonist has to do that relates to stories and to talk about the way that young people can be producers of knowledge. This book so much also talks about environmental justice, right? So they're in this fictional town that has been created because the closest city has been burned down. And so they are struggling for access for water. So I talk about them in my chapters like climate refugees, because there is like a migration component as well in this book. And so I talk about the way that climate change is impacting migration. I end, spoiler alert, I end the chapter with this quote because my analysis of the protagonist as a cuentista, as someone who takes stories and creates stories, to think about how we associate diverse stories as a way to create empathy. And I try in my chapter to talk about the limits of empathy, right? That like diverse literature isn't enough to get us to an equitable place for like people of color, for marginalized voices, right? That it's so great that we have diverse stories, but that in and of itself is not enough to transform our lived realities. So I go back to critical race theory, scholars Delgado and Stefancic, who reminds us that the idea that one can use words to undo meaning that others attach to these very same words is to commit emphatic fallacy. The belief that one can change a narrative by merely offering another a better one, that's the reader or listener's empathy will quickly or reliably take over. So again, dominant and oppressive narratives will not change overnight simply because we have more diverse stories available. And again, as I said when I was introducing myself and part of my research, right, it's trying to honor and celebrate the diversity that we have in stories, but to mark that that is just like the first step, right? That action needs to be associated with this centralization of diverse stories, that we need to change policies, that we need to fight for, right, like immigration reform, that we need to fight for healthcare for all, right? That it doesn't just stop at having diverse stories. And I think that's the end of our presentation. We have our contact information here if you want to follow up with us after this presentation, but we really want to open it up to Q&A, and I think we've left plenty of time to have a conversation with folks. So yeah, I think I'll hand it over to our moderator.
Yes, yes, and thank you both. And as we give people a chance to gather their thoughts and post questions in the Q&A, I just want to thank you for this really inspiring talk. I mean, I think this is really what we need in this moment as we face scapegoating of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like, we have to be reminded of why this work is important. And I'm really excited to read your chapter on the Council on Interracial Books for Children. I have not read either the book you highlighted there. Didn't know anything about it. So I'm looking forward to the education and of course to Sonia Rodriguez's chapter, your chapter on how young people, create knowledge themselves, and how those stories, how stories create knowledge, and correct the incorrect stories that we have absorbed, that we have learned, even as we acknowledge the limits of empathy. Those both sound great, and I will ask a question. Oh no, we've got something in the Q&A. I was sort of talking to give people a chance, but I wrote down some questions, but I see a question in the Q&A. Oh, the question is clapping. Elizabeth Elliott is clapping. So that's not a question. So, no, Naomi Wood has not a question, but a comment. We see you, Naomi. Naomi says, not a question, but a comment. I really like the idea of using hallmarks to organize the study of literature. I want to steal this for my class next semester, she says. And yeah, and that is, I love that structure of the book too, thinking about hallmarks rather than, well, here's this group, this group, this group, but what are the hallmarks? That's a great idea. You're welcome to respond to Naomi's comment, but it is a comment and not a question, so you don't have to. Oh, here's a question. I'm gonna read the question from Aaliyah Jones, who says, "Happy for both of you." Well, I am happy for both of you too. I'm happy for me too because I get to read the book. But Aaliyah says, "Happy for both of you. How does it feel to be on this side of the project? To know that you were so close to publication and sharing this work with the world?" And so we'll let you answer that.
Hi, Aaliyah. Thank you for being here. Aaliyah is one of they're in the book with a conversation with Tracy Sorrell. So man, that conversation is gonna be lit. Like I can't wait. Thank you so much for participating, Aaliyah. It feels this will be my first like academic book, right? I don't have a single monograph out yet. Looking for funding, folks. Feel free to fund. Um, and so it's just been a really interesting process to work with Marilisa. Marilisa and I have known each other 10, 12, 15 years. I just remember being a grad student, and because there weren't a lot of folks doing like Latina children's literature, everyone was like, "Have you met Marilisa yet? Have you met Marilisa yet?" At every conference, at every space. So it's just super exciting to be working on something that I'm really passionate about, not just as a scholar, but as a person. To be working with someone who I admire and who in this very like challenging field has seen my light and hasn't tried to dim my light. And so it just feels like a very special project personally for me.
Yeah, if I could respond to that too. Thank you so much, Aliyah, for being here. I mean, I think it's great. I think that part of what we're highlighting too is like that it's a struggle, right? I mean, that getting books like this out there, even people like us coming to the point where we could write a book like this after all the various challenges we've had in academia, and it's just it means a lot. Um, and I think it's also exhausting. It's also really exhausting. And even in just the constant environments we've had to write in, right? But I think it just means a lot. And again, to echo Sonia, I do remember it was about 10 years ago, I think, if not more, maybe 11 or 12. But I remember meeting Sonia as a grad student when I was at Centro, and I was not in a tenure track position, right? And I was like, keep hanging in there, and meanwhile, I'm looking at like, I don't really know what job I'm gonna get that's gonna be permanent, but keep hanging in there, keep working for Latino literature, because you're just imagining this world that really doesn't exist, right? Even though there's other people that have gone before us in various ways, but super, super thankful in terms of how our careers have blossomed, where we've been blessed to have certain positions, and hopefully also opening doors for other people, right? Because making space for other people as much as we can, really. But yeah, very thankful.
Thank you both, and also apologies to Naomi, who says sorry. And I was joking, Naomi. I appreciate your comment. I am maybe that didn't come across. And they appreciate your comment. And there are several questions here to follow up. I think maybe I will go to Julie's because that actually follows up directly on what Naomi said, and then do my best to navigate through the rest of these as well. But Julie Boat asks, really interested in the way chapters were thematic instead of based on specific groups. Did you come up with those first and then request chapters that fit, or did chapters naturally seem to fall into these themes? Can't wait to read this, and I do see the other questions here. So if you're wondering, hey, what about my question? I see them all. I'm gonna do my best. So
Oh my gosh. I know Sonia can speak to this too, but I was gonna say, like, it's kind of like when you start a book, you really don't know how it's gonna be organized, how you hope it's gonna be organized. Um, but I know that we had been talking about like what is ethnic studies, what does ethnic studies means, and like what's our introduction gonna be, right? And I think we got to a point where we really liked this model. We were gonna go with this model. And in many ways, our people had been fitting in there, right? But we actually had a chat with them that where we actually invited people to come to a Zoom to talk about how, especially when we were doing the revisions, how can you fit more within the place we're imagining you already kind of fitting into? How can you speak more to this model? So we really did that work also of getting back together with authors, and it can be hard because especially when you're doing an edit collection like this, do people really want to show up during Christmas break and like talk about, how to intro, like how we're going to fit in the intro? But hey, they did it. Yeah, they did it. And I just thought I think it speaks more to like the intentionality, right, behind what we're doing, and also like the community we're working in. But I think that answers some of that. But Sonia, I don't know if you had other things you wanted to add.
I think we wanted to make sure that we're really conscious about like of the project, right? That we were being about the hallmarks, right? And that we weren't getting lost in like this academic space. And so we both worked in like edited volumes before, but part of edited volumes before. And something that I was sharing with Marilisa is that like having a conversation with the editors usually has been not very often happening to see how it's tied to like their larger vision. Um, and so we're like, well, why not invite our participants and be like, how do this is what we envision, how do you see your chapter fitting into this vision? How can we work together? How can we work with you to make sure that your chapter is hitting these key marks, right? Because what we didn't want it to seem is that like that these were, although they're standalone chapters, we wanted to create a conversation, right? Like we're trying to put like a larger piece together, and we wanted everyone to have a part of helping us meet our vision. And so we really like took these like ethnic studies hallmarks to heart to be like, how can we practice this in the creation of our own volume?
thank you. And that is such a great way to bring the contributors to the book in as collaborators. Because for those of you out there who don't edit academic books, you know what you get for contributing to an academic book? You get a copy of the book and an item on your CV. And that's it. So it's to give people the opportunity to shape the book that's a little extra. I don't know if payment is the word, but it's a way to acknowledge that like they are why the book exists, right?
Yeah, I
Well,
just wanted to add too. We were really inspired too, like by Ansel Dua, right? In Moraga, this bridge called my back, and I know that's intense, but like that, those are the kind of lineages we saw ourselves in, and we really wanted to see something like this in this world of youth literature and ethnic studies, and there's an intentionality behind it, also, like really in the spirit of those kinds of volumes, I think that we really tried our best to put forward as well.
Which is why we went with SUNY Press, right? SUNY Press published this bridge called My Back. And we were like, okay, can we publish a book with SUNY Press? And so it was just like this amazing, like personal, but also like very political and intentional of the way that women and now like non-binary folks are shaping scholarship, right? Like these are all very like strategic choices that we're trying to make.
which is also some advice for you academics or aspiring academics. Where do you want to publish your book? You want to publish it where the work you read is published and the work that inspires you. Like that's a place to go. Let me go back to an early question from Mike McCoy, and then I'm going to jump ahead to Elizabeth Elliott and others down the list here. But Mike asks, in some YA novels with Mexican American female protagonists, the characters have to navigate the tension between pursuing academic achievement and honoring their parents who use traditional family values. In particular, Mike says, I'm thinking of Esperanza in Mango Street and Gabi and A Girl in Pieces. Given what Dr. Rodriguez said about young people producing and implementing knowledge, something I was noticing as well, and not just having it come from the top down, what do you think about the theme of Latinx characters asserting academic agency in YA books in 2025? And what do you think
Yeah,
about the role of mentors and role models in those characters' journeys if there is less of a focus on handing down knowledge to young people? Excellent question, Mike, and I will now be quiet and they will answer.
The House on Mango Street is my all-time favorite book. That was my first introduction to Latina literature when I was in college. And it has shaped my career as a scholar and as a creative writer. Um, I want to recommend, I think it's Cristina Jeda who has this like edited collection, Chicana Nerds, Chica Nerds. I'm sorry, Christina, but it does highlight other Chicana YA books where the protagonist is choosing or struggling with choosing higher education and the conflicts with their culture. So I think that's a great resource. But I wanted to think about like the small ways, right, that protagonists are knowledge producers and we may not see it that way. Right? So in the House on Mango Street, Esperanza is a witness to what is happening to her community, right? She is archiving, she is the community storyteller, right? We only know about this community because we are getting it through the lens of Esperanza, right? Because she's the one telling us what is happening in her community, right? And so I try to read it as she is that knowledge production. Without Esperanza, we don't have this community, right? We don't have the stories of this community. With Gabi Girl in Pieces, Gabi creates zines, right? There's so much happening in her world. And one of the ways that she expresses this is that she creates zines and then she starts sharing it, right? Like that's knowledge production. Um, and I think both of these folks are highlighting knowledge and choosing knowledge that is part of their community that I do think it oftentimes is in tension with what we understand as like Western traditional like school education. And so in my own research, I try to highlight, right, that like the kitchen table is also a source of knowledge, right? The kitchen table is a classroom. And so I try to read, right, Chicani Lit or Latina Lit in general through that lens, right? How can we, through these ethnic studies hallmarks, center, right, our communities as like knowledge producers?
Did you go to the next one, or did Marlies have anything to add? I can go to the next one. Go to the next one. Okay. This is a great question from Elizabeth Elliott, and actually echoes a conversation we were having just before your talk. They say, I really enjoyed hearing about your personal experiences that inform your research and work, particularly with teaching and other service roles. How do you center hallmarks of ethnic studies in your own teaching practices? How do you engage student stories and experiences in in the classroom and classroom experiences? That's a super question. Yeah, I'm taking notes on this one too.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. And I think this book in many ways is also another way that that came forward. So I will say like a lot of this with the hallmarks, what is ethnic studies? What, these come from battles on campuses that I've been in, and I'm sure Sonia can also speak to this. Like how do you create a Latino studies program in PWI? Suddenly, in 2016, that was my first story. That was my first tenure track position, sort of creating a Latinx studies program from scratch. And being the only real faculty member dedicated to that within a Latin American studies group, right? And so like you start to really think about, and your students are also asking along with you, like, what is the difference between Latin American studies and Latino studies? Like what, and you really start to see it's so different. There's a completely different community of students that's really at the center, a different political project even. And we would have these conversations together within our own awkward spaces, really trying to negotiate who we were. And then for me, what ended up happening is like organizing with those same students to say, well, what do we want instead? And we ended up founding an institute, a research institute, that came out of that, and really having to write the proposal. So students helped write proposals for that. Students participated in meetings with administration for that. Lisa, whose poem is here, I can remember being in meetings with Alisa that, none of us want to remember. And we do want to remember Alisa's poem, but we don't want to remember the meetings we were in, but really having to fight for our existence on campuses in many ways and like why our learning is important and how our learning is learning, right? Like that we're not just getting together to talk about our identities and, y'all doing those Latino things over there, y'all doing those ethnic things over there, so I think a lot of those frustrations came together in writing and in like turning this into something that could also benefit us in many ways, right? Like benefit our students is also getting them citations instead of just asking them to go to a protest, I'm just saying, because that's what really, would help their careers and get them moving forward, within these spaces. And so that's one way I know for me for sure, and really thinking about this book too, within the background that students are leaders and we work with students to also make sure that we see how they turn a critical eye, not just on the text that they're reading, but in the spaces that they're living in, including the administrations that tell them to think critically, but don't think critically about the administration, So it's just a very interesting kind of predicament, I think. But that's one way I can say for sure.
Yeah, I think so much of what we've been trying to do in this presentation is the way that our academic scholarship or our creative expression also matches what we do like as people, as educators, what we do in the classroom, what we do in our own communities. And so I've been involved in different like service projects at my own institution, sure, because I was still on tenure track and I wanted to get tenure, but it was my like ethnic studies training as an undergrad and then like as a grad student that was always at the forefront to remind me that I am an agent, right? That I do have that I am a leader, right? That I don't need to let academia like form me, shape me, tumble me until I bend to be whatever the type of academic they want me to be because I want tenure, right? Or full. Um, I was an activist first before I was as an academic, and so that has carried me throughout my academic career. Even now, as I haven't started the spring semester yet, but I'm about to start the spring semester at CUNY, and thinking about what is happening with like ICE and immigration and in New York City, right? I'm thinking about how am I going to prepare my students? Sure, I have to teach them composition and I have to teach them how to write a thesis statement, but how can I use literature? How can I use my classroom to make sure that my students know their rights? Right? How can I use my classroom space as a space where I'm teaching them what is required of me to teach them because we're in college, but how can I use my space, control my space, expand my space to make sure that my students are protected outside of my classroom, right? And I do that in all of my classrooms and all of the spaces, and that's the type of educator I've been since I started teaching, right? I don't just enter the classroom to teach them a singular subject, but try to recognize their entire humanity, right? That outside of my classroom, they're going to engage in different spaces, different subjects. How can I use my space to prepare them for that?
Thank you. I'm just, I think we'll do one other question. I see that you're answering Anusha's question in the chat, which was the one I was going to ask. So maybe, so yeah, so Anusha's question in the chat. Okay, everybody can see the chat, excuse me, the Q&A, right? That's visible to everybody. I was going to go to that one next, but you have answered it next. So maybe I will go to that next. Okay, let me go to a different one next then instead. Hang on a second. I'm also getting text here from Karen at the same time as I'm trying to moderate this. Um, and Karen points out that we are at 5 p.m. So I should wrap things up. So I can also wrap things up. And I think that is the guidance that I am currently receiving from my co-host and so many things, but also on this this conversation. So maybe that's what we'll do. This has been recorded, and so if you are coming in later to this talk, you can go back and watch it again, or perhaps you are watching me at some point in the future and you already know that it's recorded. So I will instead just wrap up here and thank Dr. Sonia Rodriguez and Dr. Marilisa Jimenez Garcia for sharing their new book and their knowledge and their education and helping us uh, educate better and draw upon our own experiences, our own lived experiences in the world, and helping young people listen to their own experiences, their own truth, and not be afraid to express those and to understand that experience can be a source of truth. And I'm kind of echoing the Combahee River collective here and many of the other works that you cited. But thank you very much, and I will conclude this talk with applause on behalf of everyone. So here I'll mute this so I don't become a
Thank you so much for having us, and thank you so much for being here. The book is out in July 2025. Get your academic libraries to purchase one, and the ebook will also be out at that time. Feel free to contact us. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Get the
Thank
book.
you. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, academic libraries, get them to pay for it. It is priced for academic libraries, but the ebook
Yeah.
will be priced for humans. So we can
That's
ebook,
real good. Yeah, no.
which is
Yes.
good. Which is good. No, it's a publishing strategy. It's not,
Yeah.
it's not the choice of the editors of the book. That's how these things work. But thank you both. And I'm going to let